Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second edition of the Doorstep podcast Book Talks. I'm your co-host for the Doorstep and a senior fellow at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, Nick Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana Serafin, also senior fellow at Carnegie Council and co-host of the Doorstep. Really excited to welcome Christopher McKnight Nichols today to talk about Rethinking American Grand Strategy. What a perfect moment in time to rethink American Grand Strategy. We have a new administration that's moving and shaking a little bit this week, right, Nick?
Yes, it is. Just today, we had the President Biden and Prime Minister Boris Johnson signing a new Atlantic Charter in the anniversary of the signing of the charter in 1941. Trying to recommit to a new coalition of democracies, but instead of tackling simply rising powers, it's also talking about climate and technology and how do we safeguard the future of the world. And several days ago, which I think leads very much into our discussion with Chris this evening, friend of the Doorstep and guest on our podcast, Nahal Tusi of Politico, wrote a very critical or interesting article, not critical in the sense of being criticizing, but critically important piece about the search for a grand strategy in the Biden administration, in the Biden-Harris administration. Is there a grand strategy that animates the foreign policy approach of the new administration? And that article provides an excellent way into setting our book discussion tonight with Chris. Because this volume that he this project that he has been running, along with his co-editors, has been about taking a different look at conceptualizing grand strategy. Usually we think of this as being done in Washington, in a few closed-off rooms by small groups of experts, thinking about the world as Zbigniew Brzezinski did, as the grand chessboard, where we move pieces on that board. And instead, this is a project which tries to get to the doorstep, tries to get down to the concerns of citizens, concerns of different social groups within society. How do they think American foreign policy ought to be structured? What are they looking for in terms of how America should engage with the rest of the world? So, Chris, if you could give us a sense of how this project got started and perhaps some of the initial findings that you'd like to share with our audience this evening.
Absolutely. So thanks so much for having me. It's great to be on with you, Nick and Tatiana, and to be with the Carnegie Council. So the project really got started out of a series of conversations with other historians, but also some political scientists and other scholars, thinking about the long history of U.S. grand strategy. And as you rightly noted, how it is very often conceptualized as limited to sorts of elites or elite opinion, the kind of thing that Henry Kissinger would do, but perhaps not the kind of thing that W.E.B. Du Bois would do, or Saul Alinsky would do, or be part of. So historians and political scientists recognize those limits. And in fact, many theorists who've worked on grand strategy for many years have also done this, and practitioners as well, right? So the phrase that we've heard, and we'll be unpacking a bit more this evening, I think, foreign policy begins at home, is something that in US foreign policy traditions and grand strategy thought go back as far as the frequent use of the term grand strategy, earlier, in fact, but definitely to the World War II period, for instance. So linking domestic and foreign has been part of that equation throughout US history. You could also argue in European grand strategy as well, and we could talk more about sort of global dimensions. But in any case, the project emerged from conversations about, let's rethink the history of US grand strategy, let's expand the parameter, see what might count there. Who are some of the hidden strategists who should figure in, including grassroots folks, including public opinion, including the broader dimensions of what it means to be a democracy and practice a kind of democratic foreign policy, right? So this was something that Woodrow Wilson, for instance, in thinking about the League of Nations, was very invested in the World War I moment. And I read a chapter a bit about that. So we brought together a whole lot of historians and folks from some other disciplines here at a conference at Oregon State University that I put together, and a number of people who really didn't consider themselves scholars of grand strategy. And I think that's an important dimension of the work we've done in this project and the broader kinds of op-eds and other work that's come out of this. Because by bringing together people who say work on environmental questions or race or gender, sexuality, reproductive politics, you can more effectively look at those dimensions of grand strategy that don't factor into traditional diplomatic or hard power configurations. I could go on a little bit more, but one finding that came out of the book, we could talk about a number of them. But when we first came together in 2016, the former head of the grand strategy program at Yale, Betsy Bradley, was part of those conversations, and she's a public health scholar. And she and I recently wrote an op-ed on how the US needs a global public health grand strategy. So we could talk maybe a little bit about that. But that was 2016 when we gathered. And one of the most important things coming out of the conference that I didn't expect was thinking about public health grand strategy and planning for, wait for it, the next pandemic. So at the time, I was working on the 1918 flu pandemic, and we were thinking about the lost promise of the moment of 1918 when the U.S. really did not take a world leadership role in public health. And the U.S. again after World War II, despite the significant role that it took in world-shaping international organizations out of Bretton Woods and the UN, et cetera, the U.S. didn't take a very strong position in global public health after World War II either. So one of the things we argue in that project is you need to look at some of these things in moments of crisis or in peacetime, which is the traditional way that scholars of grand strategy history have considered this. So definitionally, it's about matching long-term aspirational ends to necessarily limited means. That's a paraphrase of a kind of John Lewis Gaddis meets Paul Kennedy definition. And if you broaden that out a little bit further to grand strategy in other settings, you can think about that in terms of public health. So trying to solve the next crisis, or at least create the conditions so that you're ready for what sort of a Donald Rumsfeldian known unknown. We know there will be another deadly pathogen. We don't know when, we don't know where. So stockpiling resources, having allies and partnerships in place, and being ready for that just makes good sense. But it's much easier said than done when it means allocating a lot of resources in a current moment for a challenge that you don't yet fully perceive, and that might look like a waste in terms of domestic politics. And that's where a foreign domestic interconnection is really essential.
There's so many issues that brings up for me in particular, and the global health grand strategy is super important, and I think falls into this idea of, and you said it, we don't have all the resources to do everything we want to do. So how do you choose? There's the global health grand strategy. There are perhaps 20, 30 other ones we can discuss, right? How, in your research in this book, what were some of the best practices, I guess, of choosing, right? How we determine the strategies that and rank them almost, right? I think that's what it really has to come down to. And I come at this from, I'm going to say this because in your book and in many of the authors say grand strategy, it sounds so verbose and grandiose and, oh my God, it's kind of like a showstopper on Broadway. But really what it is if you're a business, right, you have a goal and you have strategies to meet that goal. So theoretically you have a doctrine, you have the strategies, i.e. the ways that you meet that goal. So it's not really grand in the sense of grandiose. It's a way to get things done, as you said. But in that respect, you do have to choose what you are able to do with the limited resources you have. And did you find any best practices in the historical record? Because you go from the Federalist Papers all the way to today. Did you find any best practices?
Yeah, well, so it's not the most prescriptive project, but I think there are certainly best practices that emerge in the historical record. And I think that's a nice way of putting it in some ways too, well, I'll take a step back. There's a framework for understanding it, right? So Hal Brands' definition of for instance, of grand strategy is that it's an intellectual architecture for achieving that means-ends relationship that you aspire to, and it has to be the ends have to be big or sweeping. If they're limited, they just don't fit, right? They're not grand. That doesn't mean it's not strategy, and that's where I'd suggest we can look to other kinds of theorists to help us think through just a little bit more what that is. So Karl von Clausewitz was the famous figure here, and Clausewitz argued something like tactics are the art of using troops to win a battle, and strategy is the art of deploying, your armies in battles to win wars. And then grand strategy is that next level. This would be, what other theorists have said, kind of not just winning the war, but shaping the peace if it's a nation state. But if you're thinking this more granular level of the kinds of ways that you're describing, and we're thinking about foreign and domestic connections, I would point us to other kinds of examples. So what's a best practice here? And how can the Biden administration kind of take that on if we were advising them in this? So one good example is the Cold War. And arguably the Eisenhower administration was the closest to what we're hearing out of the rhetoric of the Biden administration now in terms of trying to match domestic and foreign policy goals so that there's a domestic consensus or domestic public opinion, positive drivers pushing a foreign policy. What do I mean by that? Well, a lot of specialists know this story, but your average American absolutely doesn't, which is that, the State Department filed amicus briefs in the Brown decision of 1954 to end school segregation. And why did they do that? Because the US was losing the Cold War, propaganda battle against the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union could very plausibly say, look at, lynchings, look at segregation. This nation is not living up to its democratic ideals at home. How can you possibly follow their example abroad? And so one of the kinds of best practices is to really deeply inform foreign policy prescriptions with sort of rhetoric matching reality at home. Now, that doesn't always result in positive popular opinion. And so that's an interesting challenge here. And I'll point to one example where that may not be the case: immigration. It's the archetypal place where the domestic and the foreign meet. Yeah. It's neither one nor the other ever, right? But that's the one place where the Biden administration is having some problems with public opinion because, one, the Trump presidency very effectively weaponized the concept of new immigrants, even the most skilled immigrants, in fact, othering them and weaponizing the politics of immigration and migration. But the second level there is that it's an unclear dimension in terms of the positive short-term benefits for the American population. Economists agree, right? Immigration is good for virtually any country, but your average politician doesn't. So that's a place where figuring out how to triangulate public opinion between domestic and foreign is a real challenge for the Biden administration, and that was a challenge back in the Eisenhower years as well, right? So and they wound up with some fairly racist sets of policies that really look bad in historical hindsight, related to people coming across the southern border, for instance. Operation Wetback is the classic example of that. We could get into that if we want, but the point being that this domestic foreign is messy, but if in terms of best practices, it's the way to go, because for a successful foreign policy, if you're not committed to those ideals at home, or another example from Eisenhower is infrastructure, which is something Biden is pursuing, right? The interstate highways were pursued under Eisenhower, not just as a means of creating prosperity at home and having better shipping, better transport, as well as leisure practices and people driving and doing all kinds of things, but also as a way to be prepared in case there was an attack, to move military forces, right? No, Eisenhower is uniquely capable of making that case to the American population. Yeah. But that's exactly the kind of corollary that you see the Biden administration pushing, and you really haven't seen in several generations in US foreign relations. So if that's a grand strategy, if there is to be a successful Biden grand strategy, one of the best practices from the past is a much closer connection between domestic and foreign, looking for places where there's real popular opinion support for those policies, and then trying to make the case, as we're seeing with Biden abroad right now, trying to make the case for how that informs foreign policy, the deep principles that inform those commitments abroad, so that foreign audiences, international leaders then see that the kind of reciprocity between the two. And you see that as well if you look at what Biden is up to right now. He's on a kind of listening tour. He's not giving the sorts of speeches that Donald Trump did, for instance. He's also not giving the kinds of sweeping speeches that Barack Obama did. No. He's out there trying to build consensus, he would say, show that America is back. But in so doing, that's actually embodying one of those principles of cooperation and collaboration, right? Listening, taking on board as an ally, as a partner, and not perhaps sort of taking the big stick out in a Teddy Roosevelt kind of a sense.
It was interesting that you pointed out that this project got started in 2016, which really was a disruptive year in terms of the election, both in the primaries and in the general, where you had candidates, Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary, Donald Trump in the Republican primary, that really advanced critiques of American grand strategy and U.S. foreign policy as out of touch with the needs of ordinary Americans, whether it's not providing enough protection for American workers, or it's about allies and partners freeloading off of the United States. But we found that this critique had resonance in both parties. And you start this project right at a time when people are beginning to say, well, what should be? Do we need to rethink the sources of American grand strategy? It's the impetus really for our own project here at Carnegie and global engagement. And this point you then raised too about making foreign policy and domestic policy interlinked, because when, just to pick as an example, when Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez ran for re-election again, initially her take, or at least she was portraying, well, I just have a domestic agenda, not a foreign policy one. And yet when you looked at her domestic agenda, all of it was connected to foreign policy, climate, human rights standards, trade. All of these things were connected. And so now, as you said, we're coming into the Biden administration, whether by deliberate emulation or happenstance or a happy mix of the two. Are you seeing resonance from some of the things that your project generated in what you're hearing coming out of the Biden administration in terms of how it's trying to make these connections between foreign and domestic policy?
Yeah, you put it very aptly there. And I think the AOC kind of orientation to progressive politics at home fits very neatly with a kind of global progressive perspective. My colleague, collaborator, and co-editor Liz Borgwart wrote a book called A New Deal for the World. And her argument in a chapter of this book about FDR is very much about that the New Deal at home had this international corollary. In fact, arguably, it was more important in terms of advancing the four freedoms and some of the ways in which FDR committed the U.S. to the world community and to building a world order even before the war had ended, right? You noted the Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter comes in August 1941, before the U.S. is formally in the war, committing the U.S. to end the, quote, Nazi tyranny, right? And that set of commitments is very much, we'll take a step back. It's very much in the longest tradition of American foreign policy, which is to attempt to embed the meaning of America, its ideals, in its foreign relations. It literally and figuratively meant that American diplomats wore humble suits, didn't have epaulets, in the 19th century didn't have formal ranks. They therefore couldn't be seated with those in the more monarchical systems that had higher ranks. Eventually, the U.S. gives up on that because they want their diplomats much closer. But the point being that trying to really walk that walk, you see that in a lot of different eras from different politicians, but it's absolutely inherent in that. And you don't see that in the formal policy making. So that's what's a little bit different with the Biden administration. Generally speaking, as you all know, as well as I do, the foreign policy, planners don't hang out with domestic policy folks. They don't. The infrastructure people who care about highways aren't the USAID people, and they try to police those boundaries pretty safely, securely, because those portfolios matter. They only have a limited amount of time. But Biden is very self-consciously in constructing this administration and in populating it with individuals, has been pushing that. I think you can see in the public reporting precisely what you've been noting. So Ben Rhodes and Jake Sullivan, now the national security advisor, right after Donald Trump was elected, said, wait, something's happened here. Democratic domestic and foreign policy got removed from the broader public. Now, however you want to troubleshoot the 2016 election, if you are them, one of the ways that they wanted to push forward with a new orientation was to think about what Biden has called a foreign policy for the middle class. And that comes out of a number of different documents and things that scholars have also written about, people involved in my volume. And the point being that they thought democratic foreign policy was losing folks, certainly since 9/11, in terms of thinking about rash interventionism. What are the real benefits of continuing to have large-scale troop deployments? What some of our colleagues have pushed back against and called the forever wars, right? This sort of endless commitment to US-based structures abroad and actual boots on the ground, people fighting and dying for what, protecting what, and articulating those goals and ideas. And so I think what you see out of the Biden administration, and you can see it in his policy platforms on foreign policy, was a real commitment to kind of a democratic, small d democratic foreign policy that connected democratic ideals at home and policies, just like you're noting with AOC, with a foreign policy that actually talked about the ends, right? And said, look, we don't need troops in Afghanistan anymore, and thus you see the pullout. And that's not popular, and that may not fit it depends on which group you want to say, but some parts of the Democratic Party, and certainly lots of Republicans, don't find that especially popular. But articulating those ends and then saying, okay, we don't have a sufficient reason to remain, or the end doesn't justify the means in this case any further, and let's not talk about, say, the commitment or the sunk cost of this, but just talk about what it means in 2021. That is very popular, and that's the kind of thing that Sullivan and Ben Rhodes were talking about in 2016 and 2017. And I think that moving forward, if he can actually operationalize this with the administration, that's likely to have real benefits, right? Because that is reorienting the administration to what a wider swath, Republicans and Democrats, really want to see, and making clear what those investments are in foreign relations and potentially what they mean as a benefit for the middle class at home. One problem is, it's very hard to articulate, say, why a humanitarian relief in a particular place will benefit the middle class in the U.S. So some of this is more political rhetoric, frankly, but we've seen that, over the course of U.S. history and frankly, world history, right? So of course, some of it is political rhetoric designed for particular ends, but some of it I think is genuine, meaningful, and fits with this longer rethinking of U.S. grand strategy, something that Biden is very clearly invested in doing. And pushing really all of his political capital in to do. I mean, this is it for him, right? This is his final go around after 5 decades in Congress and in public service, and so he seems really invested in making some moves that, frankly, the Obama administration wasn't willing to do.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, to your point about him being really committed to this, Pew Research just came out today, actually, that I don't know if you saw it, America's image abroad rebounds with transition from Trump to Biden. And kind of it was looking at totally different countries kind of across the board and seeing a dramatic uptick, from France to Japan to Canada, to Italy, UK, where we are today, Australia, a sharp increase in kind of the US's position in the world. And I saw this also headline I want to share with you, again, to the point that is the view of the US changing, and did it really happen that fast under Biden? I was looking at some headlines before we met today, and looking at Biden's announcement to give out the global vaccines. And Al Jazeera actually said, this was their subhead: the US president cast the plan as a bold move that shows the country recognizes its responsibility towards the world. And I haven't seen that kind of a headline in the last 4 years. The country recognizes its responsibility towards the world. I don't know. Can we sell that to the American public?
Some of it will be hard. I agree with you. And history suggests that it's an uphill slog on that, poll after poll. I love teaching this to students because, when you triangulate foreign policy polling on, say, humanitarian relief or large scale development projects abroad, in the specific, Americans often support it. If you can give them a strong case for why one specific intervention matters. But in the abstract, as we all know, Americans tend to think that much more aid is given by the country and that is not that is not beneficial to the nation, right? In fact, it's the tiniest smidgen of the annual budget. So, but zooming out even further, sort of the 30,000-foot view, I mean, I think you're highlighting precisely the right things, right? So the Biden administration is slowly building through vaccine diplomacy, now buying 500 million Pfizer vaccines and distributing them globally, a kind of genuinely altruistic global public health strategy that you can then make the foundation for some of the other more difficult pieces. It's hard in the midst of a pandemic. I think this is one thing that can be sold, right? Americans want to be part of the solution, if for no other reason than for selfish reasons, right? That they can travel globally, that the world economy will be working, that they'll benefit tangibly, most likely from this. Even if they don't necessarily believe in vaccines, they know other people do. So that seems like a place to start, but it certainly isn't where you finish. And then the harder sells there, I think, will be about global cooperation, say in thorny moments of interventions or terrorism operations, and thinking about combating China, or at least thinking more robustly about what a competing belt, Belt and Road Initiative, or if the U.S. infrastructure model is something that, say, NATO and other organizations can also attempt to move forward with, or maybe through, you could imagine other things. So, for instance, Biden has initiated or said he wants to have a global summit of democracies. Yeah. What does that mean? What does that practically mean in terms of the payoff in policy and international relations? And then back to your point, Tatiana, which is a good one, will that sell with the American population? What if it's, hundreds of $billion commitment? What if it's several $1 trillion over a decade? At what point isn't wider American population going to be unhappy with that? That gets to Nick's early point. How invested are the people in the country in the grand strategies, in that big picture thinking that frankly transcends generations? If the archetypal grand strategy is containment, and it started with George Kennan in 1946 and 47, and really ended in 1989, 90, and 91, arguably with the end of the Cold War, what is that comparable strategy now? Not every president can have something that robust, that virtually none can, in fact. And what's the commitment of the people to that, to pursuing that? Because if you think about the long-term costs to the U.S. that we're still bearing in terms of base structures and collective security, some people might doubt those Cold War commitments in a way that they didn't in 1980 or in 1963.
Yeah. Just a quick two-finger and then a question based on what you've just on your comment right now, and that is to go back. And it's interesting how Eisenhower is really the archetypal figure in some ways, because it was during the Eisenhower administration that humanitarian aid, the idea of selling that to the American people, not just simply as we're doing good for the rest of the world, but we're going to buy up surplus food from American farmers. We're going to require that food aid be carried on American flag carriers. And, so therefore creating, even with that, an economic incentive for America to be more supportive of relief efforts. But what you were just saying now, it really got me thinking, and it goes back to some very key chapters that you have here in the book from different contributors, which is discussions that we normally are not used to having when we think about grand strategy. So race, reproductive rights, questions of gender, the whole emergence of the women, peace, and security field, which is not just simply about, educate, for most people think that, well, that's about, building schools in Afghanistan, but it's also about the idea of tapping into the full capital of your society and not having that be segmented. So on the one hand, it seemed that we're trying to broaden the definition of grand strategy, bringing the environmental dimension, right? We had Carolyn Kissane on a few weeks ago talking about climate statecraft, for instance. But is there also, so addressing that, but is there a risk also that this becomes a box check, right? That someone says, did we cover gender? Check. Did we cover, we have a mention about race, so race and grand strategy, check. Is there a sense also that this could devolve, as you mentioned about bureaucracies, that this becomes almost a bureaucratic bargaining, right? So someone comes in and says, I'll see your reproductive rights if you put in something about, pipelines and oil. And well, so coming at this question in the end of broadening the definition of grand strategy, making it more holistic, making it more connected, but how do we also avoid what the US government can also be very good at, which is the box check exercise?
Yeah, well, there are no simple answers to that one. And, I suspect no matter what the best of intentions of folks are, we'll wind up with some box checking. I mean, that's the very nature of bureaucracy. But, if you look at the way that grand strategy is taught, and let's be reminded that Jake Sullivan actually was teaching it at Yale in their grand strategy program before he went off to be the national security advisor. And this is true for a host of other people coming from different kinds of programs. They are experts in this, and hopefully that we can rely on their thinking in terms of these, rethought, larger understandings of grand strategy for greater public benefit. So, one thing is, remember all the debates about Donald Trump and adoptions policy. Well, that's what our chapter on reproductive politics notes, that for a long time, adoptions policy has been thought of as, that's something separate. That's outside the domain. That's cultural. That doesn't fit with hard power politics and military force. But actually, adoptions policy, gets at reproductive questions. It gets at really, in some societies, very problematic, deeply argued and felt questions about who's producing children for what ends, what groups should or shouldn't be allowed to have children, or what gender they should be. I mean, really difficult kinds of questions. And so you can go back to the Kissinger years, you can go back to different policy planning throughout the Cold War. You'll find reproductive politics in there, embedded in the policy planning. But we don't tend to find is when you're talking about, what have been the big US grand strategies, reproductive politics, sexual orientation, gender drop out. And they shouldn't. They should always be there. So if you're just conceptualizing it, if you're a policymaker, if you're a regular citizen, I would say you should be thinking about these things, and not just in the box check sort of way, but really in a much more substantive way. Race is a great example of this. So we just have US has had a very bad history of having a diverse diplomatic corps and foreign service, and it's gotten a lot worse in the last few years. The foreign service has been gutted. People fled the foreign service, particularly women, particularly people of color. It's the last time I saw some of the numbers on this, it was 80% white men, something like that, or 80% white identified individuals, and something like very close to that, a very large number were men overall. So in any case, that's not representative of the American population. One of the things we argue in the book about our definition of grand strategy is any strategy that doesn't fit with the real world in some fundamental ways has problems. And the implementation of those strategies, if it doesn't fit with the world that we live in, has significant problems, right? So if your foreign service or your cabinet aren't representative of your population, the kinds of views that they have, their worldviews, their principles, you've got a problem. And so, back to our current moment, one of the things that the Biden administration has pushed proactively is getting the most diverse set of individuals into the cabinet. I mean, that's demonstrably true. Now, whether or not that will pay off is an open question. But certainly the premise there, the core set of assumptions, is that by having a more diverse group in there, including some team of rivals folks, they don't all agree, but it's not populated by the opposite party, right? But it is populated by some people who don't necessarily agree. You will get better policy. You'll get at least more representative sets of views than pursuing that inherent compromise set of problems that any administration has. So those are ways in which it's not so much about the box checking or the categories, but more about how you analyze. So the hope is that these individuals come in with different worldviews, different experiences, different expertise to enact then more effective strategies. But there's one other piece of that puzzle, I think, which is getting back down to the grassroots. And this is a real challenge for democracies. The old arguments coming out of the Cold War was a question about, do democracies do grand strategy better than communist structures or totalitarian governments? And you can have a much more unitary grand strategy coming out of a top-down, one-party system, right? But so the messiness, democratic politics lead to a kind of, inherent set of challenges in U.S. policymaking and the foreign policy of democracies. But on the other hand, when you have the people behind these policies, it would appear that grand strategies are capable of more success. That buy-in from a broader public, back to the Eisenhower years, for instance, can lead to more. You're exactly right. More effective kinds of humanitarian outreach, more buy-in to those commitments that are less obviously self-serving for the nation state, and that in the long run, maybe to the best interest of the country. So, why did Eisenhower do that? Is a good, just basic example, because Truman was so vilified for the Marshall Plan, particularly from the farther right of Republicans. Eisenhower was able to co-opt those people like Robert Taft and the more conservative wing of the party, pull them in and say, look, we're going to put the flag on this. It's going to go out out with U.S. troops, but we are committed to this kind of project, and it is going to benefit the nation. And he could sell that. Now, he was a unique salesman in that he's a war hero, sort of often thought of as apolitical, although I don't buy that claim. We could chat about that. But in any case, that's the kind of thing that Biden's trying to do, right? This politics of the middle class. He's trying to push that forward and find a sort of consensus there. It's much harder in our current moment, I would argue. But that's, back around to your question, with the lens of race, with the lens of reproductive politics, he may be able to, he can certainly populate an administration that then can embody the core commitments of those constituencies, those kinds of arguments that then may resonate in different places in different ways. So he could build up something more cohesive than, say, having a very homogeneous administration, which is what you saw under the Trump administration. They were great at driving their core group, their base out to support their policies, but not good at ever reaching across the aisle or even finding new allies, regardless of their party affiliation.
I think that is such a fabulous segue into some of the great questions we have in the chat, if that works. I'll read them out and introduce also the writer and the questioner. So I want to go to this particular question because it talks about who is the domestic population. So question from Matthew Taylor. Thank you, Matthew. How much confidence do you have that the domestic population can effectively inform foreign policy, especially in light of recent domestic events?
Well, that is cause for concern. January 6th changed, I think, how a lot of us think about the U.S. at home and abroad. I'd start looking outward in. I think, as the questioner knows, the world community looked to the U.S. and saw January 6th as a kind of symbolic moment of fracture in American society. Domestic politics and foreign policy would suggest that there's a group of Americans who are not committed to democracy, not committed to the rule of law in the way that it has traditionally been understood, or at least in the recent past. So yes, one should have doubts. The way that those of us who are experts on U.S. foreign relations and U.S. foreign relations history think about this is very often foreign policy has been the domain of elites, as we were noting earlier. The American population, when polled, surveyed, and tested, knows very little about foreign policy, is notoriously bad going back through all of U.S. history on, say, finding other countries on the map or naming world leaders. This has been lamented in every generation. It's a simple fact of American history, and the U.S. largely the argument is by dint of geography, hasn't had to cultivate, say, multilinguistic skills, doesn't travel as much to other nations. If you're in Central Europe, you can't avoid other languages moving around, right? You absolutely can avoid that in the U.S. And there have been politicians for generations who've said that they don't care much about having passports or traveling abroad. America is where everything is, et cetera. I don't need to rehearse that story. We all know it, right? So, but that doesn't mean that the wider population doesn't have beliefs about core values for foreign policy, or what Mel Leffler often talks about, a historian of foreign relations. In the core values, vital interests of the nation, and so thinking about those, that's something that Donald Trump tapped into very clearly with his rhetoric. That and this is something I've written a lot about as well, about isolationism and nationalism. That he made an effective argument that by focusing singularly on the interests of Americans, that would be a better outcome for the nation as a whole, that the nation was being duped into kinds of deals abroad, that the longstanding commitments of troops in other places, which again haven't been very popular since roughly 2006, 2008, so certainly at the end of the Bush years, but also in the 90s. You can think about Clinton's wariness to put boots on the ground in Kosovo. You can think about there were more interventions in the Clinton years than in virtually any other presidencies, but they were much lower scale. So the goal was to have fewer deaths and to achieve U.S. ends through other means, including military means, but certainly not limited to them. He mostly wanted to do economic policies. So all of which is a way of wrapping our minds around the fact that Americans do have beliefs, core values, and that Donald Trump was able to tap into them. And that's what Biden is trying to do with this middle class effort. If you look to the history, there's a great chapter in our book by Michaela Honecker-Moore, which looks at grassroots foreign policy. Foreign policy begins at home. She argues that phrase comes out from is a book published by an advisor to FDR in November 1944. It's James Warburg, who looking at how U.S. commitments might unfold after the war, was suggesting that the U.S. needed to take a world leadership role, prevent future Holocausts, for instance, but also he feared a kind of inward turn of nationalism. Okay, we've done this. The U.S. has accomplished this. Now stop. One of the things that Michaela Honecker-Moore finds is that U.S. GIs coming out of their war experience also had very similar thoughts. Yes, the U.S. should be committed abroad, but they were very reluctant to have U.S. troops committed abroad. So they had a much more, you might call, soft power approach. GIs wrote to their representatives. They were very engaged in these questions. They may not have known quite as much, or they may have known more than the average American about the world. We could quibble with that level of knowledge. But the point being that they really had firm beliefs about the US's proper foreign policy or even grand strategy in the early Cold War. And you can find this in the historical record elsewhere. We just tend to ignore it a bit. And this is Nick's initial point. Americans care about foreign policy. Americans may not know that much about the world, as I noted, but they do care. And so finding ways to connect with them, and this is what will be the big challenge for Biden, and then educate them somewhat on some of the issues that they maybe don't know about, particular regions or ethnic groups in other countries that need support. What's going on in Myanmar? Why they should care about different groups in China and human rights violations, for instance, or what that says about production of different technologies. That's an educative opportunity for an administration. For people who already have kinds of core values and commitments. So I have some optimism that there's a broader swath of people beyond the January 6th folks who care about foreign policy, care about the US's role in the world. And just back to Tatiana's earlier point, when you look at this Pew polling, Americans are on the other end now of the mind your own business in the world moment. So that was happening in the late 2000s or around 2010. Americans wanted to withdraw more. Now we're looking at the other end of that. The Americans seem to want the US to be doing more in the world and be more assertive in a variety of ways, mostly cultural and commercial, not military. And so those commitments, I think, can be built on by this administration or by another.
I think your point about not having military engagement is important. We have Shelley Garrett commenting that elections in the US are won on domestic issues, and foreign policy is not really a winner except in wartime. And really this new generation, because we talk a lot about at the Doorstep about this new generation, Gen Z doesn't know what war is. It's just not a thing. And so their relationship to foreign policy is going to be very different. It's not this traditional Cold War framework. They don't even know what the Cold War is. What? It's going to be a different kind of framework, and it's not a wartime. You should care about foreign. It is more. You've been talking a lot about humanitarian. We touched a little bit about the environmental issues in the beginning, gender, race issues that cross boundaries. We saw the BLM protests take over the world last summer, right? But I also think it's, and we haven't really touched on this. I want to maybe mention it a little bit and see maybe it's the next chapter or the part 2 of your book, this idea that the world is more interconnected in invisible ways than we talk about. So we've been talking a lot about the tangibles, right? What you see, what we're doing, but there's this intangible connection, right? The fact that I have a friend in London and I have a friend in Mumbai, and we're all talking about watching Mayor of Easttown, a British actress playing in a Pennsylvania town, right? We're all having, right? Media, so movies, films, the amount of movies that were watched over the pandemic year that cross boundaries, international films, national films, right? So there's this invisible connection. I also give the example, Nick's heard this a bunch, maybe some of our audience has. My Girl Scouts are learning Korean because of K-pop. They don't care who Kim Jong-un is. They care about what they know about Korea, which is K-pop. And so here's all these invisible connections. And how does it fall under soft power? And how much is soft power becoming more a part of, or should be more a part of, our grand strategy discussions?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. I think you're putting your finger on a whole lot of the important through lines of the current moment. And so as a historian, I guess I would first step back and say, it strikes me as a scholar of the 1918 flu pandemic and World War I era too, the world was effectively globalized then, right? The virus, the flu comes out in February and March 1918. And by summer 1918, it's traveled virtually around the world, except for a few pockets that were able to quarantine. And then it gets into those areas as well. And that's by dint of, that's just rail and seagoing transport, and the fact that the people are traveling all over and goods are traveling all over, right? So if we've been effectively globalized for at least 100 years, then yes, then the other sort of connections are these invisible ones. They're cultural. There's certainly commercial dimensions to them too. They're intellectual. They're ideological. So I think of, if you're thinking about grand strategies in U.S. foreign relations, they very often have centered, even well before globalization, on ideology. That the U.S.'s commitment to democracy and to kinds of freedom, albeit very often imperfectly pursued in the U.S., have been things that were transcendent, almost universal, and depending on your leader or your moment, universal. So I think those somewhat visible, but mostly invisible kinds of commitments and ideas then really have sort of pushed the global community since the American Revolution. So you can think, if you think about just some of the shows you're mentioning, and some K-pop or these technologies and apps, the internet itself, where it's developed. I mean, we could slowly enumerate the ways in which there's an American-centric or just American dimension to each of those components, which is why you saw, say, in France, a pushback against Euro Disney years ago, right? That this kind of Americanization travels with these invisible elements, right? They're not without really deep-rooted problems as well. And that's something that's worth noting when you think about a kind of grand strategy of soft power, because very often soft power is rejected because it has a kind of coercive and cooptative element, right? That people in Mumbai care about a fictional situation in Pennsylvania in the midst of a pandemic that's absolutely heartbreaking and devastating India. It's a nice distraction, but it leads them to privilege the U.S. in an interesting sort of way, perhaps, right? At least, in subtle ways. So I'm just sort of trying to suggest that we need to interrogate assumptions about those invisible dimensions. But what you're noting about soft power is absolutely right. I mean, one of the really transcendent elements of U.S. power in general is that it need not be military and it need not be formal statecraft. And so what the U.S. hoped for in the days of Washington, where he wanted to be a nation that could stand on its own when the U.S. was a weak power, it's been absolutely attained by 2021, in that the U.S. doesn't need to project very much military power anymore because of these subtle ways in which U.S. culture and commerce operate globally, very far afield from the formal halls of statecraft. So, but then how do you operationalize those in a grand strategy, right? So one of the things we saw in the Trump years, which clearly virtually all commentators thought was a problem, was not having Radio Free Europe, not thinking about some of the, or not having it be the kind of have a cohesive grand strategic or just strategic dimension. What does the U.S. want to achieve in its communications abroad? How does it want to promote its version of democracy, or any version of democracy, to counter the waves of white nationalism and nationalism and kind of parochial visions of what it meant to be a nation state that have been emerging and have surprised a lot of commentators in the last few decades. Culture and those kinds of shows are part of that, right? Because they do bring us together in exactly the way you described, Tatiana. But how do you incentivize that and channel that through formal structures of government is a much more difficult set of questions. It was much easier in the Cold War when you had a singular other, right? Fighting ideologies, with culture, with commerce, much more complicated. So that's one reason I don't envy Jake Sullivan and those folks trying to figure out how in tactics, operations, strategy, you can deploy apps and Netflix, and not that you ever could really, but you could attempt to channel it or push it in some way that might achieve more of your ends. I mean, I think also what I started with, that slight skepticism and understanding the problematic dimensions of American culture's role in the world is really important. And certainly in the eras that I've studied, most intensively. One of the things that you saw in the 1920s from Latin American critics of US foreign policy was, they said this Manuel Ugarte, an amazing Argentine writer and lawyer, argued that the US had become like Rome, but it was this new kind of Rome where it didn't need to ever be there. It was always present and never fully present. This kind of visible, invisible dialectic of American power. It's been around for a century, but policymakers still haven't figured out how to fit that neatly into grand strategy. And I think that's our 21st century challenge. If the US can figure that out, it can effectively work through all kinds of challenges of other in great power kind of rivalry and competition, and in alliance structures as well, I'd suggest. But it's definitely not a simple equation there.
Let me just interject, Tatiana, before you get to the next question, because as you were talking, I'm reminded the Munich Security Conference just released their newest report, this States of Matter, and that partly is based on polling data, which, again, lines up with this question about the invisible ties, but also it speaks to generational shifts. That's something that the Munich Security Conference was very attuned to, that seeing this emerging generational change as the things that matter change, right? That we're not talking about war, the Cold War of large armies facing off against each other across the Elbe River, but it's now things like, my ability to travel, the safety of my data, the question of whether or not I'm going to get sick, the question about whether or not goods that I expect will be on the shelf when I get there. And so I think that those are all part of this transition. But anyway, I don't want to take away from the continued questions coming in. So.
Yeah, we have a couple, and then I'm very conscious of time. So we'll just do one more, and then we're going to talk about part 2 in the next book. But we have a question from Louis Fermansky and positing, should we really be looking for grand strategy, or is that just a distraction and taking away resources from other important objectives on climate and global health? Kind of a meta question.
Yeah.
But a good segue into book 2, I think.
Right. Yeah. So I think it's a good place to land right now in this conversation. Should we look for grand strategy? On the one hand, policymakers will always want to call their strategies grand. When we were talking right before this, we were talking about doctrines. Every president wants a doctrine. There was this famous moment early in the Clinton administration where they enacted this series of debates, Warren Christopher, a host of others, the Kennan sweepstakes, it was called, because they wanted to come up with a new grand strategy. They wind up with this unwieldy term, democratic enlargement, that doesn't catch on, but it does in some ways embody a kind of economic democratic promotion kind of ethos that suffused, post-Cold War U.S. foreign policy, at least during the Clinton years. Searching for those kinds of guiding doctrines or core principles are useful, right? We've had national security strategies are useful in articulating values, trying to orient all arms of government towards particular ends. And I would say, grand strategies, yes, they're grandiose. This is where Tatiana started, right? They sound like this big thing. And of course you'd want to have a grand strategy. Why just have a strategy? Okay, fine, fair enough. Enough skepticism there. What are they useful for? Well, if you think about, what are some of the main challenges of American democracy today, or for most other nation states and their systems of government? Long-term planning. Right. We somehow, just in my lifetime, we've gone from people who cared about the next generation or several generations down the line to much more short-term thinking, the next election, the next month, the next news cycle. This is, in historical terms, this is about a velocity of change. It's the way technology is interacting with news cycles and politics, and it's a trap. It's insidious. We're in a lot of trouble because of this. Grand strategy can help get us out of it, potentially, because it's a way for policymakers to pause and reflect, bring together experts, not necessarily in government, but from all walks of life, can coalesce around regular people's views. What do people want? You could even talk about focus groups if you want to go all the way down to that level. But in any case, it's a way to do sustained policy planning to think about the aspirational long-term ends and what the necessarily limited means are to achieve them. So does the US want to tackle those questions that you presented? Can the US effectively deal with climate change? Can the US, as I started out, effectively develop a global public health grand strategy to stop the next pandemic, much less help end this one right now? Only if there's meaningful long-term planning. And this really got set up in the middle of the 20th century. If you do keyword searches for grand strategy, you find they rise in the 1930s through the late 1940s. It says the US is contemplating a new world role for itself and shaping the peace after the war. Grand strategy takes off. That's when you first see the National Security Council. That's when you first see sort of a burgeoning American bureaucracy around trying to plan. You've had ebbs and flows of that over time, but its great strength is trying to think through the unknown. Right? To plan for those things that you don't know will be there, but to anticipate them sufficiently that you can at least deal with them when they arrive. Do you need to have a grand strategy to do that? Arguably not, but attempting to find one, a la Eisenhower, right? It's all about the planning and not about the plans, right? First contact with the enemy, all plans go out the window. But if you're not doing that kind of planning, and we certainly saw that in the Trump administration, eschewing planning, right, diminishing the role of experts and people who know a lot about area issues is not going to help create more meaningful strategies to then solve those big problems that are multi-generational. Can they be solved? Well, the jury's still out. None of us may live to see it. But if you want to have any hope to do that, you need something bigger than a short-term strategy. You need something much bigger than tactics or operations. So I would say you need to strive for a grand strategy. Maybe it's like striving for objectivity. You'll never get there. You'll always be biased. But if you look for that, if you aspire to that, you can get somewhere closer. And that's exactly what we're seeing with this administration, because they come out of a framework of thinking about policy planning in this sort of way. And they've learned the lessons of the Obama administration, where arguably, we know about the diminishment of the blob in those years, and this, don't do stupid shit as a kind of set of principles. Not screwing up is not a long-term strategy, right? Not having rash interventions may be smart, but it's not a long-term strategy. It's a short-term strategy. You don't invade here, you do invade there. It's very hard power centric. It's not about those soft power questions or that long-term advanced planning. So for one of our most cerebral presidents in Barack Obama, you did not see the kind of policy planning that you're already seeing under Joe Biden.
Which leaves us, what's next? What's next for you?
Well, thanks. Yeah. So, we were talking about this earlier, and I'm curious to know what you all think if we have a moment for it. One of the things that we didn't tackle as much in the book that I hoped for us to was to think about artificial intelligence, to think about questions of the next levels of and issues related to cybersecurity. So if you're thinking about a domestic foreign corollary, hacking of US elections, the potential for, say, ransomware attacks, as we've just seen on infrastructure, these are enormous challenges, grand strategic kinds of challenges as we look forward, as the world is even more interdependent and globally connected. So that's one area that I would really like us to focus on with some more chapters and deep thinking. And another area that we touch on in the book, and there's some area we've talked about a little bit today, is on the environment. There's human environment interactions. So certainly there's global climate change is a huge challenge, but also thinking about some of the more subtle ways in which they intersect. So for instance, as permafrost melts off, as there's deforestation, then we have a whole lot of other challenges, not least new deadly pathogens that get back to public health questions. But there are a host of other ways that people interact with their environments that seem really important to continue to consider in rich, deep ways about in grand strategic terms. What would you all add, if I can ask you a question as we begin to wrap up?
Well, on my mind is Tuesday's kind of internet shutdown, right? Talking about these invisible connections. And it was all because of one company's servers were a little bit skewed. The company is called Fastly. Funny name for a company that failed. So that's on my mind. The fact that what we're doing now over Zoom would not exist if we didn't have these connections. And how easy are they to just disappear and blow out if a server blows out? I think that those interconnections should be explored more. I guess maybe it's under infrastructure, right? It's internet infrastructure. So it's the intangible, tangible. And also crypto. What does that world bring us? How is it going to change us? Yeah, I think that's big and hasn't really been talked about.
No. No, and I think we're dealing with this whole idea of the decentralization epoch, and people can connect and route around the traditional ways that we've interacted. And Tatiana just mentioned Zoom, which gets rid of the need for geographic physical proximity. But is this sustainable? Do we become dependent on it? And again, how do people connect? And do they connect as citizens of a territorial state, or do they connect, as Tatiana, you said about the K-pop connections or the mayor of Easttown connections, where people are connecting in ways that traditionally we didn't think how they'd connect. But again, what are the positives and negatives of that? I think, Chris, just in the end, coming back and just recommending everyone to pick up their copy either in hard or digital form, because the questions that this raises, I think, are critical for us to grapple with. And as you said, the Biden administration is really, we're at the end of a 30-year cycle in international affairs. They're really the first administration grappling with this new environment of the mid-21st century and a changed political environment. And they're going to trailblaze either by what they do or what they fail to do is going to influence what will happen afterwards. So thank you very much for putting this project together, you and your co-editors, and for taking the time out to be with us this evening to discuss this and to be a part of our doorstep conversation.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been great to be on with you.
Thank you.